These are the organelles we covered yesterday in class. We talked about the plasma membrane actually for a while. Every living cell needs a plasma membrane. And the plasma membrane had a lot of words associated with it, like selective permeability, which basically means it needs to be picky about what it lets in and what it lets out. That's a picture of a plasma membrane. It has a very unique shape, very unique structure. Most of it is made up of a bunch of these lipids called phospholipids, lipids with a little phosphate molecule on it. Okay, those phospholipids are pretty special because part of the molecule is polar, part of the molecule is nonpolar. That basically is the reason when you take a bunch of phospholipids and throw them in a solution of water, they form this bilayer, this two-layer structure of molecules. That's the reason that cells are so picky about what they let in and what they let out. You've got these, this kind of security gate with these molecules that have a partial polar and a partial nonpolar end. They're going to be real picky about what they let in and out. So phospholipids make up the most of this plasma membrane. Then we talked about those proteins. Proteins are kind of these green things, are kind of embedded all throughout the plasma membrane. We even talked yesterday about a disorder when some of these proteins aren't working right. Cystic fibrosis. In the case of cystic fibrosis, those people do not make one of their proteins, basically in their plasma membrane, isn't working quite right. And it's the one that transports salts back and forth. Well, if that protein doesn't work right, it's not going to move salts back and forth. It's going to lead to some problems. Okay, the other two structures, cholesterol is actually found in there, and then some carbohydrates, some sugars. So your plasma membrane is actually pretty complicated. We also talked about three other parts. The nucleus, those are only found in eukaryotes. Okay, so plant cells, animal cells, fungus, protists, all those cells that make up those organisms have a nucleus. Cytoplasm, found in all cells, prokaryotes or eukaryotes. It's just the goo inside of cells. Cytoskeleton, the skeleton of the cell. Supports it. I actually found a picture of the cytoskeleton. I thought it was probably it's not a great picture, but you'll get the idea. If you were able to go inside a cell, just focus on the green and the blue strands. Those are basically the cytoskeleton. If you were kind of inside of a cell and you were able to kind of go in there and look around, you would notice these strands running all over the place. It would be like scaffolding. It would probably actually look like a bunch of spiders. It's like you're in a room of spider webs. That's probably what it would kind of be like if you were looking inside of a cell and you were looking at the cytoskeleton. All right. So that's what we covered yesterday. Today, I want to talk about something called a vacuole. Something called the vacuole. Only found in eukaryotes. When I think of a vacuole, I think of a storage tank. What does it store? Well, all those stuff that cells need. Water, salt, carbs, proteins, all the stuff you typically find inside of a cell. It's a storage tank. Okay, here's the real cool thing. I want to compare a plant cell to an animal cell real quick. Because when it comes to a vacuole, plant cells have a huge vacuole inside of them. Animal cells have a vacuole, but it's really not as big. That's important because, well, plants, think about like any typical plant you see outside, like a flower or whatever. They don't have a skeleton. They don't have a skeleton like you or me. So in order to stay upright, their cells need to be pretty firm. Well, these vacuoles, remember, are just like big bags of water. So it makes sense that a plant cell is going to need to have this big bag of water inside it to keep the cell firm, so it can hold up a plant. Okay, so that actually is another difference between a plant and animal cell that you may or may not have known. Oh, and also makes sense. Obviously, since plant cells have a giant vacuole of water, it makes sense that they would need a cell wall to provide extra support for all this water that's inside of them. Without that cell wall, the plant cell probably would burst. Okay. This is kind of more of a fun fact side note. I tried to draw a picture of a paramecium here. A paramecium is like a one-celled organism. When you guys were actually looking under the microscopes at pond water, you probably saw a paramecium. They're real common. They're real common protists. They're part of the kingdom protist family. Now, they actually have a really cool vacuole called a contractile vacuole. It's a little different than the ones up above. Imagine you're a paramecium floating around in fresh water. Okay? Parameciums are kind of salty on the inside. So what's going to happen is if they're in a bunch of fresh water, water's going to have a tendency to rush into the cell. Well, I don't know about you, but if I'm a paramecium, if I see a bunch of water rushing inside of me, I'll be afraid of bursting. Okay? But this contractile vacuole is actually pretty cool. It's kind of like a vacuole with a pump on it. It's actually kind of neat because it basically will pump out water as fast as the water is being brought in. It's very much a unique structure on this organism. We do not have contractile vacuoles, but paramecium are, and some other organisms do. It's pretty neat. Pretty neat. So vacuoles, that's it. Remember, vacuoles, storage tanks. All right, and finally, this is it. Something called a lysosome. Okay. A lysosome, this one's easy to remember too, because it looks like the word Lysol. And Lysol is used to clean things. So are lysosomes. Lysosomes are the cleanup crews inside your cells. Inside your cells, just like a typical factory, stuff's going to break down. Machines are going to break down. Things are going to get dirty. That's what the lysosomes are there for. Lysosomes, I kind of think of a lysosome as like a big bag of enzymes that are basically going to be around in the cell. And if anything it comes up to, they know they need to get rid of and throw away. They just kind of zap it with enzymes and it dissolves away. Like big bags of enzymes. Lysol. It's the cleanup. They're the janitors. They're the janitors of the cell. They contain enzymes to digest old organelles, food, bacteria, anything you don't want around. All right, yep, there's a disorder. Just like we talked about cystic fibrosis yesterday, there's a disorder. It's not real common. It's pretty rare, called Tay-Sachs disease. I'm going to show you a little video clip here in a second about Tay-Sachs. This one's a sad disorder. Okay, but it has something in common with cystic fibrosis in the fact that it's a genetic disorder. Anytime you hear of something being a genetic disorder, that means that there's a problem in your DNA. There's a problem in a certain gene in your DNA, a certain portion of your DNA. And if there's a problem there, it's going to make the wrong protein. Now, yesterday we talked about the bad protein that was made was one of those found in the plasma membrane transporting cells back and forth. In the case of Tay-Sachs, it has to do with the lysosomes. Basically, the bad protein that's being made in this case are one of those enzymes, or some of those enzymes that are supposed to be dissolving stuff away. Well, if you're not able to dissolve stuff away, it's going to accumulate. And in the case of Tay-Sachs, babies born with Tay-Sachs have a tough time dissolving fat in the brain cells. Okay? Everything builds up inside your body. Okay? You need these lysosomes to kind of keep cleaning things up, keep things real tidy. But if these lysosomes aren't working right, you'll get buildup of chemical. You'll get buildup of stuff. And if what happens in Tay-Sachs babies, fat builds up in the brain. So much fat builds up in the brain that it crushes the brain. It crushes the neurons. It's a real sad disorder because babies start off seemingly healthy and normal. But about the 6th, 7th, 8th month mark, they start to deteriorate. They can't sit up anymore. They can't roll over. They don't smile anymore. So they go from smiling to not smiling. Then it just gets really worse from there. This movie will show it. Babies don't usually live past the age of 5 with this disorder. So this movie clip is actually about, it's from the same movie that you saw yesterday, Cracking the Code of Life.
That's
Now, it's on a side note, they get a little detailed here, not much, but a little bit. The first thing you're going to see as soon as this pops up is, remember how I said it all starts in your DNA. You know, your DNA is your blueprint, your code, the code for who you are. And a genetic disorder like this starts off with a mistake in that code. Well, if there's a mistake in the code, again, the wrong things are going to be made. So they start off, this is kind of interesting, they start off with this picture. This is, if you could, you can't see DNA because it's too small, but you can actually find a way, you can read the code. When it comes down, and we'll talk more about this in a couple of chapters from now. On the screen right here, you see a bunch of letters. Okay, if you look closely, you'll notice the only letters you see are either going to be an A, T, C, or G. Okay? A, T, C's, and G's. That's basically the code. Scientists who work with DNA spend a lot of time looking at A, T, C's, and G's because that's basically the code of what DNA is. It's really weird because in the case of Tay-Sachs and most genetic disorders, you know, human DNA has 3 billion of these letters, okay, that make us up. 3 billion. But when you have a genetic disorder, a lot of times it's just one letter that's wrong. And that's the case of Tay-Sachs. You have one letter, maybe it's this A right here, who knows? That's wrong. It should be a G. And it's amazing such a tiny change makes a huge difference. And that's kind of the first thing they talk about. I'll let you guys watch.
And one reason it's so important to understand all those parts, to decode every letter of the genome, is because sometimes, out of 3 billion base pairs in our DNA, just one single letter can make a difference. Allison and Tim Lord are parents of 2-year-old Hayden.
The two things that I think of the most about Hayden, which a lot of people got from him right from the beginning, is that he was always, I thought, very funny.
I think you're very, 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 very sweet.
I mean, he loved to smile and laugh. And he just used to guffaw. I mean, this was later when he was about 1 year old. He just found the funniest things hilarious. And so he and I would just crack each other up.
Hayden seemed to be developing normally for the first few months, but Allison began to notice that some things were not quite right.
I was very anxious all the time with Hayden. I sensed that something was not the same. I would see my friends changing the diaper of their child who was around the same age, their newborn, and see the physical movement and the legs moving and things like that, and Hayden didn't do that.
Happy birthday to you.
Doctors told them that Hayden was just developing a bit slowly, But by the time he turned a year old, it was clear something serious was wrong. He never crawled, he never talked, he never ate with his fingers, and he seemed to be going backwards, not progressing.
I remember the last time he laughed. And I took a trip with him out to pick up a suit because we were going to a wedding that night, and we came back and it was really windy, and he just loves to feel the wind, and so we had a great time. We came back and I propped him up right here on the couch, and I was sitting next to him, and he just kind of threw his head back and laughed, like, what a fun trip, And that's the last time he was able to laugh. That's really hard.
It turned out that Hayden had Tay-Sachs disease, a genetic condition that slowly destroys a baby's brain.
What happens is a child appears normal at birth, and over the course of the first year begins to miss developmental milestones. So at 6 months, a child should be turning over. A child is unable to turn over, to sit up, to stand, to walk, to talk.
Tay-Sachs begins at one infinitesimal spot on the DNA ladder when just one letter goes wrong. Say this cluster of atoms is a picture of that letter. A mistake here can come down to just 4 atoms, that's it. But since genes create proteins, that error creates a problem in this protein, which is supposed to dissolve fat in the brain. So now the protein doesn't work, so fat builds up, swells the brain, and eventually strangles and crushes critical brain cells. And all of this is a result of one bad letter in that baby's DNA.
In most cases, it's a single base change, as we say, a letter difference.
One defective letter out of 3 billion, and no way to fix it.
That's real poor.
Tay-Sachs is a relentlessly progressive disease. In the years since his diagnosis, Hayden has gone blind. He can't eat solid food. It's harder and harder for him to swallow. He can't move on his own at all. And he has seizures as often as 10 times a day.
For children with classical Tay-Sachs disease, there's only one outcome, and children die by age 5 to 7, sometimes even before age 5.
As it happens, Tim Lord has an identical twin brother. When Hayden was diagnosed, that brother, Charlie, went to New York to be with Tim. And of course, Charlie called his wife, Blythe, to tell her the news. Blythe had been Allison's roommate in college and her best friend.
What are you going to say about that?
Charlie told me that Hayden had Tay-Sachs. He called me on the phone and he told me immediately what it was. I went up onto the computer and looked it up and then just couldn't believe what I read.
Did you finish your cookie?
Blythe and Charlie had a 3-year-old daughter, Taylor, and a baby girl named Cameron. Cameron was healthy and happy except for one small thing.
On the MTSAD website, it talks about the typically between 6 and 8 months is when the signs start coming, but one of the early signs is that they startle easily. And Hayden had always had a really heavy startle response. Well, we noticed that Cameron had a comparable startle response, not quite as severe, but absolutely not like Taylor had had.
As soon as she saw that early warning sign on the Tay-Sachs website, Blythe went to get herself and Cameron tested.
It was another week. It was exactly a week until we got the final results on Cameron's blood work. And then the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, we went into our pediatrician's office, and he had the results. And we found out that night that Blythe was a carrier and that
Cameron had Tay-Sachs.
Tay-Sachs.
He said, all he said was, "I'm sorry."
Tay-Sachs Tay-Sachs is a very rare condition. It usually occurs in specific groups, like Ashkenazi Jews, and even then, the baby must inherit the bad gene from both parents. So even though there is a Tay-Sachs test, the Lords had no reason to think they would be at risk. And yet, incredibly, all four of them, Tim and Charlie and both their wives, all four were carriers. That was an unbelievably bad roll of the genetic dice.
Hey, little nugget.
Charlie and I are incredibly close and have been all our lives. And when I think about him and Blythe having to go through this, it just seems really cruel. It just seems too much.
I had already geared myself up for being my brother's rock, and I couldn't imagine having to help him and go through it myself.
Here's Blythe.
For families like the Lords, and for everybody, the Human Genome Project offers the chance to find out early if we're at risk for all kinds of diseases.
I love Taylor.
I would like to see a really aggressive push to develop a test for hundreds of genetic diseases so that parents could be informed before they started to have children as to the dangers that face them. And I think it's within our grasp. Now that they've mapped the human gene, I mean, the information is there for people to begin to sort through. They're horrible, horrible, horrible diseases. And if there's any way that you can be tested for a whole host of them and not have them affect the child, I think it's something that we have to focus on.
Hayden Lord died a few months before his third birthday.
What makes this story especially hard to bear is we now know that a law...
Okay. Yeah, not the most uplifting. So every time you hear of a genetic disorder, it doesn't take too big of a problem in your DNA to cause the wrong protein to be made, which will go on to cause problems. And like I said, the reason I bring this up now is because it kind of affects the function of the lysosomes, which is basically that organelle we just spoke about today. I thought it was interesting. They mentioned something, the whole point, the whole movie, this is like a 2.5-hour movie about something called the Human Genome Project, mapping the human chromosomes. When you guys get a chance, there's a really cool poster up here. I know it looks really complicated, but it's not. It's actually a poster showing all of the chromosomes in humans, and it shows you all the genes. You know, I said genes make up chromosomes. The Tay-Sachs gene, the one gene that Hayden had that was wrong, is on chromosome number 15. Okay, so there's an actual spot in your chromosomes where all of these genetic disorders are found, and if there's a problem, it's kind of sad. Okay, hey guys, rest of the day, you have about 10-15 minutes, about 15 minutes. Finish up your leaf decomposition labs, and those are due tomorrow. Come see me with questions.